All right, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whenever you're watching this, kids. This is the second in the two-part long-run video series that we're doing. So this is for AP Macroeconomics. We're talking today about the long-run self-adjustment process, which is a very specific and very, I don't say difficult, but it takes a while to grasp question type that AP exam loves to utilize. And it's a category of question where it'll be almost exclusively on an FRQ. You can see some multiple choice questions where they'll try and sort of steer you around it. The basic idea is the question will ask you what happens in the long run, and they'll give you a short run change, and you've got to figure out what happens next. So for some of you guys, you might be thinking, well, yeah, I can figure that out because like we spend more than businesses can make more stuff. It's like, no. This is a different can of worms. So this is one of the things that students in my class, and as far as I can tell in most AP Economics classes, students struggle with this concept a lot. So take your time through this video. If you've got to re-watch parts of it, that's fine. At the very least, I will be giving you a set of rules to follow, a set of steps to follow that will give you a 90% chance of getting any question about this right. The 10% is that College Board might just pick some weird thing to do on the spot to just mess with you, or pick something super weird and obscure and just make it a trick question or something. Those I can't predict for, but 90% of the time I can give you this. The methods I give you will work and get you the correct answers and hopefully some level of understanding on it. I think that's about it though. So let's get into it. The long run self-adjustment. Oh, Nelly. So, sorry, I'm just prepping my brain for the fact that this is one of the things where I know people struggle, so I have to try to explain super well on this one, and even then, even if I explain it really well, it's going to be kind of hard to figure out. So, the long run self-adjustment. So, as we get into this, short run versus long run, mentioned this in the last video, but we mentioned that real wages can change in the long run, that prices are no longer sticky in the long run, and because of that, you have a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. The key assumption for today's thing, the sort of ultimate rule that we are trying to follow, that whenever we're answering these questions, this is the thing that is tattooed on the inside of our eyelids, is that over a long enough period of time, in the long run, the economy will self-adjust or self-correct and revert back to long-run equilibrium. What this statement is telling you is that the end game, the goal, for an economy is to be at long-run equilibrium, which from the previous video is where all three lines intersect. I mentioned that in that video. That's like the happy spot for your economy. They want to be there. Whenever we're doing a long-run self-adjustment problem, the assumption is that we're going to end up back there. So whenever we do one of these problems, when you finish the problem, you need to be ending at long-run equilibrium. When your shifts are all said and done, your graph should end up with all three lines intersecting. Basically, our economy follows that trend line, that business cycle sort of trend line. We're always coming back to it. We dip away from it for a bit, we always come back. We dip away, we come back. We dip away, we come back. These fluctuations, these events, they're sometimes called supply shocks or demand shocks. These events that cause a quick little change in our aggregate demand or aggregate supply are diversions. They are temporary. They are fluctuations. They are not going to be holding true forever. Things like recessions go away. Things like periods of economic growth also go away. We zigzag back and forth. So that trend line is sort of the ultimate crux, the axle by which our economy turns. So for these long-run problems, we are always trying to get back to that situation. So, the wages thing. This is what's going to matter the most. Let me move my head out of the way here. This wages thing is what's going to be sort of like the skeleton key for solving these problems. So as I mentioned before in the LRAS part of the notes, if you want to watch the video, go for it. Wages are sticky in the short run. Those of you that have jobs know that you don't get pay raises very frequently. A lot of the times that people have like contracts that limit how long they get pay, how they can get pay raises for minimum wage jobs and things like that. Those places are not legally required to ever give you a pay raise, so they're pretty slow about it, which means that they are slow to adjust to change in the price level. But in the long run, those wages can change. Since the fixed element ceases to exist, because we have a long enough period of time, eventually I do get a pay raise. Eventually, you work a job long enough, you do get a pay raise. The key word is eventually, and the long run is eventually. So that ability to change wages, as well as the idea that the economy is self-correcting, are sort of like these two keys we need to unlock these problems. Again, those keys are wages can change, economy is self-correcting. If you understand these two things, and if you keep these rules in mind, these sort of like background things to understand, then these problems will make sense. But you gotta stick with me, and you gotta write a whole bunch of stuff down. So the best way I've found to teach us is to just show you the problem. Show you a problem with it and work our way through it. I have every part of this animated in the proper order. Thank sweet God, so I don't have to draw it. You can just go off what I'm saying. So here is the problem that is a long-run self-adjustment problem. The way the problem will be phrased is, what will happen in the long run if the U.S. economy is currently at full employment and the U.S. government lowers income taxes? What will happen in the long run? Okay, so the economy is at full employment. I know that, so I know how to start this graph. The first things first, you got to draw. This is always a drawing thing. We are always drawing this. So first things first, I draw this. And again, this is an economy at long-run equilibrium. That's because it says at full employment. I don't draw this whenever I want to. I draw it because it said I'm at full employment. So I'm at full employment. Everything's going freaking awesome. Everything is super smooth. And then they're like, hey, game changer. The U.S. government lowers income taxes. So we have lower income taxes. Okay, cool. This is like the Trump tax plan back in 2017. And actually, it's not a bad corollary for it since we were pretty close to full employment at that time. So we are lowering income taxes. Cool, got it. So what happens on this graph first in the short run? I know the question asks what happens in the long run, but you do have to do the short run first, because that does happen first. So first things first, U.S. lowers income taxes. What happens to this graph? Pause. If it pause me, figure out what happens. Okay, so what will happen is this is an aggregate demand shifter. Lowering income taxes will drive up more spending because consumers now have more money in their bank accounts because they have lower income taxes. They can now spend more. This will drive up consumer spending, which means that aggregate demand will go up. There we go. So aggregate demand goes up. We are now in a state of disequilibrium, or at least in such a way that we are no longer at long-run equilibrium, right? We're now here at point B. You don't have to label points, point A and point B. I'm just doing this so I can reference them for the explanation. We're now here at point B, which if I was to ask you what is the economy experiencing right now, at point B, we are in an inflationary gap. So we are over here at point B. And most of you would stop there because that's what happens in the short run. But the question asks what happens in the long run, and this is where that first key thing comes into play. In the long run, the economy is self-correcting. It is always going to try to end up where all three lines intersect, and right now it doesn't, meaning we aren't done with this problem yet. So the second rule was that wages can change. So here we go. We open up from the short run. That was the short run. We open up from it now. Wages can change. All right. What happened to price level? Well, price level's gone up. Okay, well, if price level's gone up, wouldn't most workers be asking for / demanding a raise eventually, right? Inflation's happening, things are getting more expensive. I would most reasonably ask my employer, hey, cost of living adjustment time, please and thank you. Can you pay us all more since everything is more expensive? And that actually does happen. A lot of times that we will be acquiesced to in that way. But if businesses do that, if businesses, as a reaction to the price level increase, decide to pay their workers more, what happens to my aggregate supply curve? If businesses decide to pay their workers more, what happens to my aggregate supply curve? My short run aggregate supply curve. I would decrease it, right? When we talked about our supply shifters back then, we talked about like labor and the cost of labor. That was part of it. Yeah. So our output rises, but over time, the LRAS curve will shift to the left because that price level change is going to cause the price of your labor goes up. It's going to cause the price of labor to go up because businesses are going to start paying their workers more. You can also think of it as when price level goes up, the cost of production is going to go up eventually too, right? The cost of their resources are going to start going up. They're not going to be able to make as much stuff if the price level is higher. It's going to hurt their ability to make things. And their ability to make things is the LRAS curve. And this is the confusing part, I think, for most students. When a question asks what happens in the long run, the line you end up moving is the SRAS curve most of the time. Which is weird because that's a short-run aggregate supply curve, but you've got to know not the name of the line, but what the line represents. And the SRAS curve is our ability to make stuff. Our LRAS curve is just our ideal amount of production. And our ideal amount of production doesn't have anything to do with the cost of it. It's just how much we could do based on everything we have. So the reason why I move my SRAS curve back is because when the cost of labor goes up, that doesn't change our ideal amount of production, because ideally we would have the correct amount of labor and this wouldn't be a problem. But it does change my actual ability to make stuff, because when workers cost more, I cannot produce as much right now. So my short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left, and I will end up here at point C. How I drew this was on purpose, because mentioned in my two rules, wages can change, and I have to end up, and my economy wants to self-correct and get back to equilibrium. Did I end up at long-run equilibrium? Yes. Pencils down, that's the end of that problem. And that's the long-run self-adjustment. Some of you are like, oh, I see why this is hard. It's like, yeah, this is why this is really tricky, because this is take the short run part that you probably understand. I can move SRAS or I move AD as a result of a situation the question gives me. Got it, no problems here, Mr. McRitchie, cool. In the long run, we then sort of open up the possibility that those price level changes actually matter, because they do, they matter a lot. And that in doing so, it's going to affect mostly our SRAS curve, because our ability to produce is the one that's going to be affected by that price level change more than anything else. Because wages now have to be changed, and wages changing affects supply, namely SRAS. So that's the idea here. So again, those steps were do the short run part, which is the aggregate demand increase. Okay, based on the price level change, what is going to happen to wages eventually? Which in this case, price level is higher, businesses are going to start paying their workers more. Based on that, what happens to my graph? Okay, well, SRAS decreases if they're paying their workers more. Do we end up at long-run equilibrium? Yes, you did it right. No, start over. Because you have to end up at long-run equilibrium for a long-run self-adjustment. That's what it's adjusting to. It's trying to get back to long-run equilibrium. If it doesn't, then you messed something up along the way. If a question says what happens in the long run, the answer will always end up being they get back to equilibrium. What you've got to show them is how. What you've got to explain is how does that happen. And in this case, it's, okay, due to the increased price level but from the increase in aggregate demand, they're going to start paying their workers more, which is going to cause their cost of production to rise, decreasing their ability to produce things, decreasing SRAS, and getting them back to long-run equilibrium. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot. So in the long run, when we change aggregate demand, like we just did, when you change aggregate demand in the long run, it affects the price level, but it doesn't end up affecting output, because you always revert back. You always get back to long-run equilibrium, which is at a specific X value. Those diversions are temporary. So your X value, output, GDP, doesn't really end up changing. We start producing more, making more stuff, but then we have to pay our workers more, which makes it so we can't produce as much stuff, and our GDP has gone back to where it was before. Does affect the price level, so if you look at that slide, we went from A to C. My prices did go up, but my GDP really didn't. The SRAS line is moving as a result of the change in price level due to either an eventual change in wages, is how I normally phrase it, or the change in the price of resources, which includes labor. But like when price level goes up, the price of everything goes up, including the price of their resources, which makes it so that SRAS would go down. Remember, the economy is always trying to move to long-run equilibrium. I don't know why it blanks out my highlighted stuff. I don't like that. Oh, that's weird. It's weird that it didn't animate this part, whatever. This is the opposite. So we started the blue. You have a decrease in aggregate demand first. Output and prices start to fall. If prices fall, then businesses can pay their workers less now. If they pay their workers less, they can increase aggregate supply and get back to long-run equilibrium. So this is the same as the previous problem, just flipped. The you could have said they raise income taxes, and you would have this drawing. When you do this on the AP exam, no, you do not have to do this like 1, 2, 3, 4 bit, or even A, B, and C, but you do need to label your equilibriums. So these P1, P2, P3, Y2, Y1 thing, you do need to label your lines, AS1, AS2, AD1, AD2. You can label this LRAS and this SRAS, that helps, things like that. But when we change aggregate demand, what is going to happen in the long run is that SRAS is going to move to get us back to long-run equilibrium due to a change in the price of resources or in wages. Actually, make sure we write this part down, actually. I think this is an important thing to write down. So I'm going to clarify it a little more. So you can write this rule down. If a question asks what happens in the long run, and there was a shift in AD first, like the short run change is a change in aggregate demand, like these changes in taxes or whatever, what happens in the long run is that SRAS will move to get back to long run equilibrium. And it'll move because businesses change wages or are responding to a change in the price of resources. Both of those things are tied to the price level. Both of those things are tied to the price level. So that price level drop is the most significant thing here in terms of telling you what happens in the long run. Price level is going down, okay, it's going to cost businesses less to produce things long term because the cost of resources will go down and they can start paying their workers less because things are cheaper. Well, if they pay the workers less, they can produce more because now they have more money to spend on other things, or they can hire more workers. And bingo, bango, bongo, we get to point C. We increase aggregate supply and shift further. As a heads up, this is why on your aggregate demand, aggregate supply questions, they don't do multi-line shifts in the short run. Mentioned this in class when we were doing practices of like, hey, if they're giving you a scenario for an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph thing, just shift one of the two lines. They are never asking you to move both because they're saving the move both thing for this, for the long run stuff. They were saving that for just that. The only way you should ever have both lines move is if you're doing a long run problem. Okay, quick little tangent for a brief second. An adverse shift in aggregate supply, a decrease in aggregate supply. This has come up in my class, but I don't know if I ever did it in a video for you guys. I want to make sure that I talk about it. So a decrease in one of the determinants of supply shifts the curve to the left. This is like labor cost going up, right? When you have that, when you have a decrease in your aggregate supply curve, this is the short run aggregate supply curve I'm talking about. You will have less output now, and a lot of the times if you're going from like full employment, you're going to below natural rate of employment. You have higher unemployment now, and your price level is going to go up. That's called stagflation. It's actually a vocab term. It's a decrease in aggregate supply, which causes stagflation, a combination of a recession and inflation. You have both problems happening. Output is falling and prices are rising. And the problem is that the government, who might want to try and fix that problem, has a really hard time fixing both at the same time, because usually a way to get out of a recession is to spend more, but spending more causes more inflation. A way to stop inflation is to cut back on spending, but less spending means a bigger recession. So the government has a really hard time with this thing called stagflation. Again, that's caused by a decrease in aggregate supply. That is a weird tangent. It's just a thing that is in the notes that you need to write down at some point that I forgot to put in the previous video. So I'm putting it here because I'm about to do a decrease in aggregate supply. So let's do that for a long run problem. So let's say the question asks, because I'm going to make this accurate. What happens in the long run if businesses experience an overall decrease in human capital? If businesses experience an overall decrease in human capital are your workers' knowledge and skills. So that scenario is literally saying your workers get magically dumber. That can happen over time because of like worsening education systems. It can happen suddenly if all of your workers start like just huffing glue or whatever, or just throwing 7 Sharpies up their nose and start sniffing real hard. That's not good for your brain. So like I guess that can happen. Let's say that's a scenario. Let's say that dumb kind of thing is a scenario. So we have a decrease in human capital. Okay. What happens in the long run? So again, first things first, what happens in the short run? Have to do that first. Decrease human capital, that affects my ability to produce things, which means it's going to affect SRAS, short run aggregate supply. So I'm going to shift that line to the left because now I can't make as much stuff. And this is stagflation in action. Because my spot is now, actually I can just tab it. is up here at point B as opposed to point A. At point B, I have a higher price level and lower output. That's two bad things. Those are two bad things happening at the same time. That sucks super hard. Prices are going up. We are making less stuff, less money, and losing jobs. Big, big, big bad. So here's the tricky bit. The question asks what happens in the long run. Well, let's follow the exact same logic we were doing before and see if it works out for us. So the previous logic was, okay, price level goes up, so businesses will eventually have to pay their workers more, and we'll get back to equilibrium. Okay, let's follow that. Businesses start paying the workers more. What happens to my aggregate supply curve if businesses start paying my workers more? Can they make as much stuff? No. If I do the exact same logic as I did on the previous stuff, I would actually end up like this, with another leftward supply shift ending up further away from equilibrium and not back at equilibrium, meaning that's wrong. I can't do that, because I mentioned you have to be getting back to long-run equilibrium. So how can we justify it? What can we say? What can we do logically? Here's the gross part. Businesses don't have to pay their workers more, right? They don't have to. That isn't a rule. They're not required to pay their workers more. In fact, they can change wages in the long run however they want to. You can see in the long run people can start getting paid less. That's possible. It's not likely, but it's possible. So what if businesses here started cutting wages? And importantly, using that money to advance their ability to produce things. Cutting wages, paying their workers less, and using that money to help them make more stuff. Whether that is buying more resources or hiring more workers at that lower wage. What would happen to this graph? Well, if businesses start paying their workers less and hiring more people and producing more, then they would see an increase in aggregate supply, right? They would move back. Correct. Wait, that was weird. Sorry. It would move back. And that's the actual way to solve this problem. And that's the other one. And that's super weird. Because I'm going to write that's AS1. I'm also going to label it as AS3. So the idea was our first shift was a decrease in aggregate supply. Because there was some situation, I said a decrease in human capital that made it so we can't produce as much stuff. The question asks what happens in the long run. And remember, the most important thing is that wages can change and that we're going to try to get back to long-run equilibrium. So in what way can I change wages that will allow me to get back to long-run equilibrium? I need to get back to long-run equilibrium. So how I would change my wages is I would actually cut them here. I can pay my workers less, hire some more people, ramp up production, and get back to my original equilibrium spot, which is long-run equilibrium. So here's the important thing to take away from this one. No matter what line moves first, whether it's aggregate demand moving in the short run, like the first one I showed you, or aggregate supply moving first, it doesn't matter which one moves first. The line that will always move to get us back to long-run equilibrium is SRAS. Because of that wages thing. Because of that wages rule, where it's going to be based on the fact that we can change wages, and changing wages changes aggregate supply, namely SRAS. What you've got to think of is what can businesses do to wages here that will allow them to get us back to long-run equilibrium. That's how you're solving the problem. What can a business do to wages that'll get us back to long-run equilibrium? In this case, cool, we need to get back to long-run equilibrium so businesses could pay people less, because that would get us to produce more and get us out of that problem. It would. If you paid them more here, that wouldn't help, because that would move aggregate supply further to the left and would not be directly helpful. So it's very tricky, but the idea for the long run problems is the line that is moving in the long run is the SRAS curve. And the logic there is because the thing that is changing in the long run is wages, and wages are a determinant of my short run aggregate supply. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So once again, the SRAS curve is shifting in the long run. This is due to a conscious choice by businesses to change their wages to allow them to get back to long-run equilibrium. AD is not capable of moving on its own in the long run, since spenders don't have, like, autonomy. Like, I am dependent on my income. I am dependent on a bunch of other factors in terms of allowing me to spend more or less. Businesses can raise and lower wages over a long enough period of time whenever they want to. They have freedom to do that. There is a limit on how low they can go, but they can raise and lower them kind of at will. They have the leniency to do that. In the long run, that's an eventual period of time. Wages change in the long run. They can go up, they can go down. That can happen relatively easily. So it's going to be, in the long run, SRAS is what's going to change. So again, what to do when a question says in the long run. There is what I call the natural route, and we'll talk about in the next video for this week what's called the policy route. So the natural route, also referred to as like the classical economics way, which is the economy will fix itself, is the idea. The economy is self-correcting, and in this context, that means businesses will respond to changes in price level by either by increasing production or decreasing production, which should move the equilibrium point back towards long-run equilibrium. The idea being that the businesses will control their production ability, and to be clear, you have to tell them how they're doing this. On an AP exam question, they will almost always ask you to explain it. So you have to say, okay, in the long run, businesses, due to the higher price level, will start to pay their workers more, or businesses, when there's that initial decrease in SRAS, as a means of ramping up their production, will lower wages and hire more people and produce more. You have to give them explanations. If you're looking for help on this, don't worry. There's two different practices this week that are going to help us with this. One that is like our normal practices, which is Wednesday, and one that is an FRQ practice we're doing on Friday, just to really cover your bases here, because this is hard. So the policy method is what I'm going to get into in full detail on our next video, but I'll give you a brief little hint of it now. This is the idea that, hey, say we're in a recessionary gap, and the question asks, what should the government do in the long run? In that case, the sort of keys to the economy are not in the hands of businesses. The keys are in the hands of the government. And in that case, the government will almost always do some sort of fiscal policy or monetary policy to get us back to it. Those things do change AD. So those things like increasing government spending or decreasing taxes, those things would change AD. Don't worry about that yet for this video. That's just sort of the teaser for the next one. It's like, yeah, you can change AD. The question just has to sort of tell you that's what's happening. So that is it for this video. I know that is super hard. I get that that is a super confusing thing, but the basic idea and the rules are, the underlying rules that you have to understand are, in the long run, we assume the economy is self-correcting. In the real world, that's not exactly true all the time, but in Macro 1, which is our simplest version of economics, we assume it's self-correcting. We assume the economy is self-correcting, and in the long run, wages can now change, meaning SRAS has a degree of flexibility that the AD curve doesn't have now, because businesses can change wages whenever in the long run. They can raise them, they can lower them, whatever they need to do to help the economy, because we're assuming that they're going to, because businesses fail when the economy fails, and businesses succeed when the economy succeeds. So those are the two background things. The other big rules are, it doesn't matter which line moves first in these problems. The thing you're always going to do at the end is you're going to move SRAS to get back to long-run equilibrium. If you moved with your demand curve to the right first, cool, I'm off my long-run equilibrium. I need to move SRAS back to the left to get us back to long-run equilibrium. If I moved AD left first, I'm going to move SRAS to the right first. And if I moved SRAS first, it doesn't matter. I'm still moving SRAS to get back. So if I moved SRAS to the left, then in the long run, I'm just going to move SRAS back to the right. I'm always moving my SRAS curve in the long run. And again, that's because businesses have a degree of autonomy, a degree of independence, that they're not reliant on others to tell them what to do. They can raise and lower wages in the long run whenever the hell they want. So because of that, they can drop wages when they need to hire more people and produce more. They can raise wages when they need to start to slow down and pump the brakes on the economy a little bit. By them raising wages, they will not be able to produce as much stuff, that kind of thing. Cool? That should just about cover it for the long-run self-adjustment. Those 2 days are difficult things. The long-run aggregate supply stuff is the hardest thing we have covered in the class so far, I think, from a pure logic standpoint. There's a lot of stuff you have to take at face value. They're based on economic assumptions and economic theory that goes back a couple hundred years at least. And because this is Macro 1, we're not going to get into a lot of the criticisms of those things, only because going down that rabbit hole would mess our graphs up super hard, and we're trying to keep things a bit simple for now. So that is it for the long-run self-adjustment. Thank you guys for watching, as always. Really do appreciate it. The next video we'll be doing is over fiscal policy and how we can use that to try to fix the economy too, and not rely on businesses changing our wages and possibly lowering them when we don't want them to be lowered anymore. Cool? That's the idea. Great. Thank you guys. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Really appreciate it as always. Best of luck.